Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how U.S. government policy will impact your bottom line. I'm your host, Seana Smith. Now, it's certainly been a busy week at the White House. President Trump signing more executive orders while he works with his administration to cut the federal budget and also fulfill his many campaign promises. We're going to cut through that noise, break it all down, what it exactly means for your wallet. Plus, we'll be joined by Capital Economics Group's chief economist, Neil Shearing, to take a look at one of the main topics of conversation so far during Trump's presidency, and that, of course, is tariffs. But before we get too into it, let me introduce my co-stars here. We have Rick Newman and Ben Werschkul. Guys, it's great to see you.
Hey.
Hey there.
So, Ben, let me kick it off with you because I know you're just chomping at the bits. I've heard a lot about, it's my first time hosting Capital Gains, but I've heard a lot about your note card. So what is on your note cards today as we are just over a week into the Trump presidency?
Sure thing, Sean. I did something special for you this week, just in honor of the sort of flurry of things. This represents the number of note cards we could have this week. You know, obviously we've had a sort of unbelievable, unrelenting flurry of news, but I wanted to focus in on three that I think are notable flare-ups that are important for the market, but also kind of are issues that the market's going to be wrestling with for the years ahead. I think the through line, I think for folks to remember is that Trump here is walking up right at the edge, some would say over, into kind of unprecedented, illegal, and perhaps a market destabilizing activity. But he hasn't yet sort of pushed beyond that. So the first one, sort of, I guess we'll talk about as well, but is tariffs. Tariffs are a big one as well. And that is the big question. The open question at the moment is sort of how to listen to Trump on this issue. Is it the maximalist bluster? Is it the gently floated moderate trial balloons that we sort of see kind of behind the scenes, or is it these escape hatches that they have in on their tariff plans? We won't know, and readers and people listening to this might not get the answer until we might have more answer than we have, given that we're taping this on Thursday. But Trump is clearly sort of trying to go big on tariffs, and we're unclear what things. Two other quick ones too is the government spending, the freezing of government spending. There was a back and forth this week on federal financial assistance. The through line I think that here is important is Trump clearly signaling what he wants to do on spending and potentially going up to sort of a term called empowerment. But in terms of policy, he's really signaling he wants to cut sort of social safety net programs. Rick wrote about it really nicely this week, especially Medicaid, sort of whether or not it's going to get done sooner or Congress is going to do it later. That's clearly a priority that's going to be felt to the economy. And then the third one is just the federal workforce. This is another thing. We've had some buzzy stuff this week. There was an announcement about buyouts that were clearly modeled on Elon Musk and Twitter. But another thing that he talked about this week was firing Democratic members of independent commissions. These are commissions that aren't that well known. The National Labor Relations Board is relatively well known, but this is the same legal authority that protects Jerome Powell from being fired. They're independent in Washington parlance. So Trump is right up on the line on all three of these, but interestingly hasn't sort of crossed over into areas that might destabilize the markets or the larger economy. So we'll see what we're going on there. Rick, what's your through lines?
Ben, you got a note card for that number 3? I didn't see the note card.
I do. I wrote them down. They're just
it's lost in your pile there.
Yeah, it's in this pile.
I can understand.
A lot of these are blank.
Big pile.
Okay, I can understand. Okay, so Ben, you have your note cards. I have my spreadsheets. I don't have a spreadsheet prop. That wouldn't be very interesting. But I sat down this week and put into a spreadsheet the main executive orders and other Trump actions that I think markets need to pay attention to it. And I have 26 entries. Now, some of those executive orders are not going to happen. I mean, some of them have already been frozen by courts. Others, almost all of them face litigation. And we know that Trump did not sit down and say, now I want all of these executive orders. I want to think these through very carefully because I want to make them last. No, he is trying to shock the system. I mean, this is the mainstream analysis out of Washington these days. And I don't know if I'm part of the system or not, but I'm not that shocked. I don't. To my mind, Trump has not done anything that he didn't basically say he was going to do, and to some extent, he has actually done less He's doing deportations, for example, but there was kind of a big press show of going to New York City, going into the lair of the enemy, the Democrats in New York City, and they picked up like 20 migrants. So this, it's kind of a shrug here in New York City. Now, this could all just be getting started, of course. I mean, there could be much more to come, but this was supposed to be shock and awe. I'm not that shocked, and I'm not that awed so far.
But I think the question, though, is how quickly that conversation can change, right? And what you were just saying, just in terms of, and Ben, you alluded to this too, but it hasn't been the worst case scenario, maybe what some have been bracing for during that first day or first week that we've seen from President Trump. But given the fact that he has remained consistent with some of his criticism when it comes to his rhetoric, what he does intend to do, yes, you could make the argument that he has peeled back and has backed off of, obviously, the worst threats when it comes to tariffs, but still very much top of mind, I think, for investors, even though they're very much still looking at this first week of presidency, I think it's fair to say, through rose-colored glasses.
Well, if we want to talk about tariffs, so when I did a preview of what is likely to happen with regard to tariffs during Trump's administration, based on Wall Street analysis mostly, what is the street bracing for? The recurring theme in all the analysis from the Wall Street firms and many of the forecasting firms was, we don't think tariffs are going to be all that bad, partly because during Trump's first presidency, he said he was going to do one thing, but what he actually tried to implement was a lot less. He created these off-ramps, and we already see that happening again, I think. So just one example is the China tariff. So Trump campaigned on a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports, all of them. And that he hasn't talked about a 60% Chinese tariff since he's been in office. So now he's talking about a 10% tariff, but that is not in place yet. So I think Trump is afraid to do major tariffs, and that's for one simple reason, which is the market would there'd be an adverse reaction to the market. So I could be wrong. Trump, the big shock could be coming, but I think the shock at this point would be if Trump really did impose significant tariffs. At least I don't think Wall Street is pricing that in.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take on this, Rick, in that
we're not allowed to disagree on this podcast. When I say something, you're supposed to say Rick is exactly right. Okay,
Rick is perfect, but
what's your argument?
Here's why he's not. I don't disagree with you at all that folks around Trump and Trump himself are weighing the market implications here. The Scott Bessents and Howard Lutnicks of the world are trying to tell him, if you go to on these certain things, the markets are gonna have a problem with it. And I have no doubt that that's a really compelling argument. What I I think that sort of markets might underestimate is how much Trump cares about tariffs. They're really real for him. There's a lot of issues that he talks about that you kind of get the sense he's not sort of personally invested in. That's not true with tariffs. It goes all the way. It's a sort of through line of his career. They're real for him. It's a sort of irresistible force meeting an immovable object, and that these two things are in collision. I'm not saying one is definitely going to win over the other, but I wouldn't underestimate Trump's real interest in doing tariffs, especially, and we haven't even gotten to this point yet, but these sort of universal tariffs he wants to talk about, because not only because he likes them, but he talks about paying for his whole agenda with them. So he's very invested in making them happen, and maybe the sort of powers that be sort of push back on him and hold him back, but he personally really wants these.
I think, okay, he may personally want them, but he also personally wants the stock market to go up and Americans to love him because he's created a new golden age in America. I think Trump is at risk of becoming a blowhard on tariffs. And here's one that caught my ear this week. He's going to impose tariffs on Russia, in order to get Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. I'm sure Vladimir Putin was like, oh, man, you got me now. I mean, Biden already is trying to cut me off from the whole global financial system. He's chasing down my shadow tankers. But, you're going to put a 25% tariff on the 4 objects that we import to the United States. Trump's like, yeah, my tariffs are going to end that war in Ukraine. I mean, this is, it gets kind of ridiculous. Okay, maybe I'm going to be humbled in the next few weeks when Trump really does try to roll out some tough tariffs, but I don't know. I'm not buying it.
Ben, I got to go with Rick on this one, just in terms of what we have seen, just how important the market and economy are to Trump. Not to say, I mean, I don't really know what I'm talking about at the end of the day, so I could be proven wrong come Saturday, February 1st, if something is implemented. But Ben, I guess my question, though, also is what about that internal disagreement that it could cause, right? We've talked a lot about the fact that Speaker Johnson, he's very much has been skeptic just about across-the-board tariffs. Besson also obviously has walked that back. If you were to follow through, kind of how that changes some of the dynamics that play inside the White House.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, this is a real live debate, and there's no doubt there's people around Trump that are saying you kind of gotta moderate on this. One interesting element of this with Congress that I'm really going to be watching closely is how much Republican lawmakers, realize the unpopularity of this, sort of distance themselves from it rhetorically, but kind of let it happen because the president has the ability to do this on his own. Speaker Johnson can say, oh, I'm kind of wary of these tariffs, and there's a lot of folks on Capitol Hill that'll say similar things. But at the end of the day, if they can say, oh, look at all this money coming in from tariffs, it helps me get my tax cuts, they might fall in line a little bit more. So that's the dynamic, I think, between the White House and Capitol Hill on this, because at the end of the day, the president has pretty unilateral authority here, and that politically can kind of work in Republicans' favor, given the unpopularity of them for certain.
All right, guys, we got to leave it there for right now. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Neil Shearing on the other side. Welcome back to Capital Gains. I'm Seana Smith. We are joined now by Neil Shearing. He is Capital Economics Group chief economist. Neil, it's great to have you joining the conversation here. We've been talking a lot about tariffs, the threat of tariffs under President Trump, how likely, how unlikely it is to happen. Clearly, we have Rick on one side, Ben on the other side. You get to cast the tie-breaking vote here. How likely is it? Are they coming?
Well, look, I'm an economist, so I'm going to say that on the one hand,
it's a safe way to play it.
Yeah.
Smart man.
exactly. Yeah. Look, my sense is that tariffs are coming, but I don't think they'll be quite on the same scale that the president has talked about for obvious reasons, and that is that I think it would tank the market. And I think a common thread running through a lot of the critical cabinet appointments, the senior cabinet appointments here, is a background in Wall Street, and I think there's going to be a lot of lobbying from within the administration to try and resist some of the more aggressive tariffs. Now, we've done some modeling at our end as to what those tariffs would do if they were all implemented, and it would take the tariff level in the US back to something close to where it was in the 1930s, and it would push US inflation somewhere close to 4%. Yeah, that's a one-off change in prices. Obviously, that's not ongoing inflation, but it's a pretty big jump in consumer prices. And of course, we're calling into question the ability of the Fed to cut interest rates further. And that is something that the president has said that he wants. So I'm skeptical that we're going to get all of the tariffs that the president has suggested are coming down the track. I'm skeptical, too, that the administration has really worked out what the strategy is here. A tariff's a new permanent source of revenue that can be used to, for example, fund the extension of the 2018 tax cuts, or are they a tool to extract concessions from trading partners? I don't think they've worked that out. I think for all those reasons, tariffs will come, but I don't think they're going to come in quite the form that has been suggested so far.
Neil, help us try to think through how to tell when tariffs will become problematic for markets. Like, what are the signals going to be? And is this really like just a trial and error thing? Like Trump could impose a 10% tariff on China. If market's okay with that, he could raise it to 20%. Is it really like that? Or is there something that markets would look at right off the bat and say, no, that's not, we're not going to buy that?
Well, partly it depends upon the level at which the tariff is set. But we all know that markets, it's as much about confidence as anything else sometimes in markets. And I think the tone is important, critically important here too. I think also what's going to be important is not just what the US does, but how America's trading partners respond. My sense is that what's going to happen is that Europe and China will be seen to respond. They'll have to retaliate in some form, show some kind of backbone. But I think they'll do that in a measured way, in a way that is calibrated so as not to escalate the situation. If that's wrong, if I'm wrong on that, and we get China and Europe responding in kind, then I think that the market reaction would be adverse too. So it doesn't just depend upon what the US is doing.
Yeah. Neil, I wanted to follow up more on the retaliation side because you've written so interestingly about that. Tell me more about sort of how you see that playing out, and is there even a scenario here where kind of what Trump does is less important, given the measures that the other countries could take, and what are the long-term consequences? I heard a lot of chatter around the Colombia tariffs this week that this means Colombia looks towards China more. Do you buy into that?
Well, so I think you're right that a through line here is that the US and China are set on a course of geopolitical competition, right, and economic rivalry, and that's something that's underpinning this administration. It underpinned the Biden administration, and of course the first Trump administration, and it goes all the way back to China's entry into the WTO in 2001. That was supposed to bring China into the global fold. Cause it to liberalize both economically, but also perhaps politically too. And clearly that has not happened. Instead, it's emerged as a rival to the US. That runs through all of this, and it's forcing other countries to pick a side. I still think that push comes to shove, Colombia sides more with the US for defense and security reasons than it would do for China, where it perhaps has some stronger economic ties. But still, that is certainly a consideration here. Now, when it comes to retaliation and how the other countries respond, I think that's the geopolitics here is a consideration too, because if you're Canada, if you're Mexico, there's not much, frankly, that you can do to retaliate against the US. About 20% of Mexico's economy is accounted for by exports to the US. The same is true of Canada's economy. Really, the geography, economic ties, financial ties, social ties, historical ties dictate that that Canada and Mexico are going to be aligned more with the US. Now, if you're China and you're pitted in this, as Xi sees it, this kind of superpower rivalry, Trump wants to make America great again. Well, Xi wants to make China great again. They are not going to back down. They're not going to do anything that harms them economically, but they are not going to be seen to back down. That's why I'm sure some kind of deal will be done. There'll be some great signing in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. But I do think it's going to fundamentally reconfigure that US-China relationship. I certainly think of the idea of a Plaza 2.0 accord that some have talked about. I think the geopolitics of the situation is a good reason to think that that's not going to happen.
So I'm going to ask about our closer neighbors, Canada and Mexico. Trump has threatened a 25% tariff on imports from those two countries. I think he said his deadline for that is February 1st. Now he has kind of given an off-ramp. But let's say those tariffs go into effect. In one of your notes, Neil, that we're working from here, you say a 25% levy against those countries would deal a devastating blow to both Mexico and Canada's economies. Both would likely fall into recession. Well, if you're an America firster, do you care if Canada and Mexico fall into a recession? Does that matter to us?
I don't think you care necessarily if Canada and Mexico fall into recession. However, I do think you care if the price of your car, your new vehicle, is just going up by 20%, because not only is a tariff being placed on the import from Canada, it's being placed potentially by Canada on imports from the US, and the same is true from Mexico. And the component parts of these cars sometimes cross the border 6 or 7 times before being assembled within the final product. So I think that if you're an American firster, you don't really care about the trajectory of the Mexican or Canadian economy, I'm sure, but you do care about the cost of living in America. And I'm afraid tariffs, although sometimes the adverse consequences of tariffs are overdone by economists, I do think there's evidence that in the first round of tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, the cost was essentially passed on to American consumers. So the idea that this is a tax paid for by the Canadians or the Mexicans, or for that matter, the Chinese, is baloney. Is paid for by American consumers. We have empirical evidence of that. And I think that, if you're an American firster, you should care about.
Talk to me a little bit more about that when we talk about the ripple effect and what exactly the inflationary pressures could look like here in the U.S. What does that scenario in your modeling look like?
Well, the first thing is that this is an area where economists get themselves tangled in knots over. I think presidents get themselves tangled in knots over it as well, frankly. As I said before, it's not a tax paid for by exporters. It's a tax paid for on the import. I think all economists agree on that. And then when there's some disagreement, it's about what are the inflationary consequences of that? Well, the first point to say is that it's a one-off step change in prices, right? Inflation is an ongoing process, I think. It's best to think of it as an ongoing process, whereas an increase in tariffs is a step change in the level of imported prices. And the degree to which a tariff increases prices domestically depends not just upon the level of that tariff or the good it's levied upon, but also what happens to the currency, the exchange rate. Does the dollar appreciate and mitigate some of the effect, cushion some of the effect of the tariff? What happens to the price that exporters charge the importers? Because if the dollar appreciates, they can cut their local currency price and as their dollar price to receive a higher local currency price. Does the firm that's importing it absorb it in its margins or pass it on to consumers? All of these questions matter. And it means that if you're thinking about the kind of inflationary consequences, they're not straightforward. We've done some modeling. We looked at what would happen if the US levied a 10% universal tariff on all imports and a 60% tariff on imports from China. That would push US inflation to just above 3% by the end of this year. That's a one-off change, and then next year inflation goes back down towards 2%. But that gives you kind of sense of the order of magnitude, I think.
Yeah, and how do you think of this universal tariff piece of it? Because I think there's the Canada, Mexico, but Trump is clearly thinking of these universal tariffs as a sort of down the road thing. How do you kind of decode that in terms of the possibility of their happening and the larger consequences? In your recent note, you talked about Nixon imposing 10% tariffs, but that was clearly a kind of negotiating strategy, and they didn't last very long. Is that how you think of it with Trump, or is it different?
Well, I think that the bilateral tariffs are better thought of as a negotiating strategy, right? If you don't do this, then we're going to put a 25% tariff on you or a 60% tariff on you. I think in this instance, a universal tariff is better thought of as a mechanism to raise revenues permanently. Now, 10% universal tariff would not raise a great deal of money for the US economy, maybe something like 0.5 to 1% of GDP revenue, something like that. So not the US economy, the US government. But it would help, maybe forecast some extension of those tax cuts that are due to expire this year. So I think universal tariff is more likely to be imposed as a means of raising revenues on a permanent basis, whereas bilateral tariffs, I think, are more than the kind of negotiating tool, trying to extract concessions from trading partners.
All right, Neil, wish we had more time. We have to leave it there. Thanks so much for taking time to join us here today. We really appreciate it.
Geeking out on tariffs.
Geeking out on tariffs. We'll see who's right. Only time's going to tell. Maybe we'll be back debating this. I have a feeling we're going to be back debating this very soon. All right, Neil, thanks so much. Of course, our thanks to Rick and Ben as well. And thank you all for tuning in to the latest episode of Capital Gains. Make sure to like and subscribe to Capital Gains wherever you get your podcasts. And until then, we'll see you next time on Yahoo Finance.